The Bengals have plans to pay some of their best players this offseason, but I think one of them is going to be more challenging compared to the other two, and in this video, I'll explain what hurdle they have to overcome to get it done. Hi again, Bengals fans. John Sheeran of A to Z Sports Cincinnati here, and I know a lot of you were disappointed at the lack of transparency from this team's decision makers in the front office and the personnel department about how this past season went down, which is why it was very interesting to see Duke Tobin speak with Kelsey Conway of the Inquirer about all those things that we were just talking about. Tobin and other members of the Bengals staff were down in Mobile, Alabama to watch the Senior Bowl and the practices and get acclimated and familiar with some of the top prospects in this year's draft, and he had some time to talk about the Bengals roster, where it goes from here, what happened this past year, and perhaps most importantly, it's big three players that need money this year. I'm of course referring to Ja'Marr Chase, Trey Hendrickson, and T. Higgins, maybe even perhaps in that order, because you have extension opportunities for both Chase and Hendrickson as they're under contract for 2025, but you have a brand new contract that you need to offer and get T. Higgins to sign before he enters free agency in March. And because that deadline with Higgins is naturally coming up pretty quickly, whereas you have a lot more time to deal with Chase and Hendrickson, maybe you want to prioritize Higgins in that regard, but I really do think that all three of these situations are vastly different from one another. And the most interesting case out of all three, in my opinion, I think it has to involve Hendrickson here. Because think about this for a second. It is a foregone conclusion, a formality, if you will, that Ja'Marr Chase is going to be a Bengal for the foreseeable future. They were very close to getting that deal done right before the season. They have the exact blueprint of how to structure the contract. They just follow what Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb signed for and just give him a raise because that's just how it works, right? He signs last, so he gets more. Like, yes, obviously it helps him that he just won the Triple Crown. He's arguably the best receiver in the NFL right now, a position that the Bengals have always historically paid. He's going to get his money. Like, that's not a worry. And Higgins may not be viewed quite as high as Ja'Marr Chase, but if he were to hit the open market, there would be a bidding war that would ensue, and he would get a very expensive deal that would be very similar to what Ja'Marr Chase gets. Like, that's just how it works, right? Other teams are competing and throwing in offers, and the offers get bigger and bigger and bigger, and it ends up being an inflated price. The Bengals don't want anything to do with that, obviously, which is why they would prefer to not have T. Higgins hit the open market. And the fact that T ended up hiring the same agent as Ja'Marr Chase and firing David Mulugheta, there's enough reason to believe that staying with Cincinnati is his primary motivation. Basically, there's always been assurances that Ja'Marr Chase is going to be here long term, and there's a renewed sense of hope that Higgins is going to do the same thing. But I don't think that renewed sense of hope exists for Hendrickson quite yet, because this situation has been a bit tricky for the past year now. The Bengals gave Hendrickson an extension in 2023 that will basically allow him to continue playing here this year, right? So it was adding on 1 year to his 4-year contract that he signed all the way back in 2021, so it runs through 2025. And it was a raise, it was a pay bump, because he proven to outplay that contract that he signed now 4 years ago. But Hendrickson did request a trade this time last year because he still wanted more. He wanted more longevity. He wanted a longer contract in general from the Bengals, and they weren't willing to give him that this time last year because, again, they just extended him in the summer of 2023. Now, what Tobin said when asked about Hendrickson this week was, quote, "He has earned a pay raise and a bump and an extension. We're cognizant of that, and we'll give that to him, but whether we agree on what that looks like is what is to be determined." And what that translates to is we will offer an extension and a pay raise to our Defensive Player of the Year finalist, our all-pro pass rusher who led the league in sacks, but it is up to him to determine if he thinks that it is worth signing. Because Hendrickson is not like Chase and Higgins anymore. He's not in his mid-20s. He is going to be 31 years old this year, and he fits a profile that the Bengals typically don't invest a ton of money in anymore. Like, they've been really scarred about handing these types of major contracts out to guys 30 and above ever since Geno Atkins and Carlos Dunlap. They signed extensions in 2018 when they were 30 and 29 respectively, and neither of those contracts ended up working out in the long term. And I think we can all agree that Hendrickson is clearly an exception to the rule here and that he has shown no signs of slowing down, but that's still a hurdle that I think needs to be overcome by the Bengals here. But I think the more compelling hurdle here, and maybe one that applies to both Chase and Higgins and Hendrickson, all three of them, is that these are still negotiations where the Bengals have a firm price point where they don't want to move off of, and it's up to the player to either accept it or deny and just live with the consequences. And I think when you're dealing with these three players specifically, these three cornerstone franchise pieces, the most important pieces outside of Joe Burrow, you need to have a little bit more leeway in your negotiations. And especially with Hendrickson, when you're dealing with an exception to the rule here because of his age and where he is in his career and the fact that this is going to be his third major pay raise, don't be so pressed this time to win the negotiation at all costs, to come away thinking that you got a bargain for someone who probably deserves a little bit more. I think if you were to do that, not only would you ensure that Hendrickson is here along with Chase and Higgins for the foreseeable future, but you would also do some work and maybe repairing some bridges before they're actually burnt, because clearly Hendrickson was not happy with how negotiations were going this time last year, which is why he requested the trade in the first place. I think it just adds up when you constantly penny pinch with your stars, and that kind of percolates down to the locker room where it's like, hey, I'm doing everything that I can to help out this team here, and you guys are still being very stingy. So with Chase, I think that's going to get done. I don't think there's going to be a lot of issues there. It may not happen immediately, but it's going to get done this offseason. With Higgins, I think there's renewed hope that it happens and that he'll take a Bengals type deal. But with Hendrickson, I really do think it's a 50-50 shot. I think that if the Bengals continue to stick to their old ways, which is probably the safe assumption, then there's going to be even more animosity and turmoil with that situation. And maybe at that point, you then look at a trade. But if they were to take this one step forward and actually reward their best defensive players since Geno Atkins, I think everything's going to be fine. And that is just one of many ifs the Bengals have to tackle this offseason. And we are going to cover all of them right here on A to Z Sports Cincinnati.